Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about a number of different movements, specifically social realism, regionalism, and the Harlem Renaissance. Now, all of these movements are going to have some characteristics in common, and sometimes all of them get dumped under the larger umbrella of social realism. But because the aims of these separate movements are separate, I'm going to try to parse them out a little bit, but you're going to see a lot of interconnectivity. We're going to start by talking about social realism, which in some ways is the hardest to sort of separate out. We're talking about a movement that really begins in America probably really, in the late 1920s and certainly through the 1930s before World War II. This is a time of global crisis in a lot of ways. There's economic recession, beginning with the stock market crash of 1929 in America and the Great Depression. It's a time of greater social and racial conflict in America, and it's also the time globally of the rise of new problematic fascist regimes, which are going to ultimately lead to global conflicts in World War II. So it's a time of a lot of crisis, and the painters who tended towards social realism were interested in addressing these political issues. So this is an art that is not necessarily realistic in terms of style, but realistic in terms of addressing social issues. So instead, this is a movement where, for the most part, the art was trying to be legible and accessible to the public, and it addressed issues like working class, labor unions, and it addressed issues of people who were cut out of the sort of political system. So art was seen in a way as a tool where it could fight exploitation. So it's a political tool, and that's something that we've seen in the past if you think way back to where we started in this class, when we were looking at the paintings of artists like Daumier and Courbet. Now, as I said, many of the artists that we're going to look at today could get pushed under the larger umbrella of social realism, but I'm going to start by looking at the works of two artists whose works don't fit into the other categories. And first and foremost, Ben Shahn, who is an artist who, more than anybody else in the 1930s, was associated with social realism, and also has a sort of local connection because Ben Shahn is an artist who spends much of his career working in New Jersey. And in fact, if any of you ever end up at William Patterson University, you'll notice that their art gallery is the Ben Shahn Galleries, named after Shahn, who actually died the year that the arts building at William Patterson was being constructed, and so the building was named in his honor. And then we'll look at one work by Isamu Noguchi, which I'm showing to you because it's really fascinating, and also because there's another great local connection. And if you have never been to the Noguchi Museum, which is actually in Queens, New York, so not too far away, it is a wonderful, beautiful space filled with some really amazing sculpture. So we'll take a look at these two artists, and then we'll look at the works that sort of extend out from this movement. So we'll begin by talking a little bit about Ben Shahn, who was Lithuanian by birth. So he was born to a Jewish Lithuanian family. They faced persecution, and when he was young, his father decided to flee to America and move his family. And so when he was about 8 years old, he ended up moving to Brooklyn. That was in 1906. He ended up working as a young boy in his uncle's lithography shop, and so he was trained in both printmaking and also typography. So he had this early kind of training in different media, although he was more interested in painting. He will ultimately be a painter, a printmaker, a photographer, a muralist. He also works as an illustrator and a graphic designer. Photography is going to be very important for him, and we'll take a look at him as a photographer very briefly in a little while. But he mostly, in a lot of ways, he used photographs to supply the material for his paintings. And you'll see that his works never, even when they're based on photographs, never really resemble any kind of photographic realism. So he is the quintessential social realist, and his works are all tied to social activism. He becomes very interested in making works that rally against fascism and social injustice and hardship. He focuses on victims of social abuse and of labor struggles. And one of his most famous works, I mean, the most famous work he does, has to do with an issue like this, which was an issue of social justice. So Sean's most famous work had to do with the trial of two men. So the story goes like this. On the 15th of April in 1920, there was a guard at a shoe factory who was robbed and murdered, and some $16,000 were stolen. 3 weeks later, two men were arrested, a man named Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who were a shoemaker and a fish peddler, and they were charged with the crime. So the trial went on, and a lot of people saw a lot of unfairness with the trial. First of all, there were witnesses that said the men were nowhere near the crime at the time, and they were largely ignored. And instead, the prosecution focused on things like the anarchist political beliefs of Sacco and Vanzetti. So ultimately, the judge, who was a man named Thayer, he passes the death sentence, right? They're found guilty in 1921, and there are these sort of worldwide protests. And it's interesting, when Sacco and Vanzetti were first found guilty, Sean said that he was not very political, like he wasn't really paying attention to the events. But in 1925, he was in Europe, and there were demonstrations in Paris. So the Sacco and Vanzetti case got attention around the world. Einstein weighed in for their support, so intellectuals were supporting them. Ultimately, there was a committee to look at perhaps overturning this. It was called the Lowell Committee, but eventually they recommended to the governor not to stay the execution. They got a partial rehearing a few years later, but it was the same judge, and so they were found guilty again. And ultimately, the two men were executed on the 23rd of August, 1927. So Sean, when he got back from a second trip to Europe, started thinking about this as a subject for painting, and he said the following. When I got to thinking about the Sacco Vanzetti case, they'd been electrocuted in 1927, and in Europe, of course, I'd seen all the demonstrations against the trial, a lot more than there were over here. Ever since I could remember, I'd wished that I'd been lucky enough to be alive at some great time when something big was going on, like the crucifixion. And suddenly I realized I was. Here I was, living through another crucifixion. Here was something to paint. Now, Sean worked from photographs to create this, which was one of his most famous images of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, but he does quite a number of them. And again, he works from photographs, which he then sort of splices together to create this new moment. So, for example, we see three sort of separate moments. We see Judge Thayer in the courthouse in the back raising his hand to take an oath. We see the three Lowell Committee members, which are the ones who sort of confirmed their conviction. In the middle, the men in the hats. And then in the foreground, we see the already executed Sacco and Vanzetti. And all of these were based on photographs, but they were manipulated by Sean. So, for example, in the photograph that showed the men in their coffins, there were mourners standing nearby. And here they've been replaced by the members of the committee. The members of the committee are all shown holding flowers. So it's meant to be this very sort of hollow gesture of maybe remorse or pity, but it's an empty gesture. You notice the men don't look at Sacco and Vanzetti. Instead, they sort of look out. Their features were exaggerated and distorted to be not very flattering sort of caricatures of the men. And again, they were based on photographs. And there's a an emphasis on their clothing. The man in the middle, who was Lowell, was actually, um, if he was the president of Harvard University. And so there's this academic gear on him, and it's meant to emphasize the social difference, the social class difference between these men. Other than this, it's done in this style, which is incredibly flattening and two-dimensional and almost cartoon-like. We can see a compression of the space, which is created in part by those lines in the background. You could just see these sort of black lines to create the stairs to the courthouse, which are the black lines repeated in the vertical columns of the courthouse building. So that helps to compress the space. The style is done in this very flattened patches of paint, sort of harshly outlined on some of the figures to create this very two-dimensional style. And it eliminates all sorts of unimportant details, reduces everything to its bare minimum. There are, however, though, some interesting symbolic moments in it. And again, this is supposed to reference like Christian martyrdom, like Sean talked about with the crucifixion. But they're very interesting. If you see Thayer in the background, and it's a window, but it looks almost like a poster, but you see him with his hand raised. He's looking towards the direction of this lamp outside. And the lamp looks like it's this bundle. It looks like what's called a fasces, which was actually used as a political symbol in like images of George Washington, like a bundle of sticks tied together. But here that's meant to be a play on the term fascism, for example. And again, that shows sort of the political nature of the entire image. By the way, this was based on original photographs, as I said, and you can see on the right-hand side not only a photograph of Sacco and Vanzetti, but you can see another painting done by Sean of the two men based on that photograph. So you could see the way he's working from these references. Now, it's this idea of using art as social activism that then guides Sean's career for quite some time. And in fact, right after he finished the Sacco and Vanzetti series, he began a series of pictures dealing with the story of Tom Mooney. So Tom Mooney was a labor organizer, and he and another man named Warren Billings were convicted of first and second degree murder, respectively, after a bomb went off in 1916 during a Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco. So the Preparedness Day, that was part of Woodrow Wilson's campaign to get the country ready for entering World War I. And so this bomb goes off, and it killed 10 people and it wounded 60. And ultimately, Mooney and Billings were arrested. They were tried, and as in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, there were problems with the trial. There was evidence that people had perjured themselves in testifying against them. People apparently had been paid for testimony against them, and the thought was that particularly Mooney was being targeted because of his union activities and his anti-war activities. So he was sentenced to death in 1917, but ultimately his sentence was commuted to life in prison. And so this is then the case that Sean takes up, and he made a series of 15 gouaches, smaller paintings, and then he did this picture, which was a one larger tempera picture, which you could see is sort of organized like a triptych, and we've seen triptychs before with Otto Dix. In other words, it's organized like it is divided into 3 separate panels, kind of like this is usually the form of a religious altarpiece, so we see the hearkening back to that idea. So in the very center, we can see the figure of Mooney himself seated in a chair, kind of almost acting like a sort of Madonna and Child enthroned. And then we can see 2 separate scenes. Really on the right, it's sort of a mashup of more, but we see on the left and right hand side scenes of Mooney's mother, who was an Irish immigrant who spent the last years of her life trying to get her son freed. And she traveled all over the United States. She traveled abroad. On the left-hand side, we can see her in front of the California Supreme Court, when they decide to not, they refuse to release him. And then on the right-hand side, we can see sort of a group of people, and that was based on a photograph. These were all based on photographs again. There was a photograph of a May Day demonstration, a communist demonstration in 1932 that was printed in the paper. And we could see that demonstration there. And then we see his mother again on the right. You could see she's got a banner across her chest that says, "My son is innocent." And we're supposed to see the difference between left and right, particularly the Supreme Court figures, the sort of artificiality and pretension of these political figures compared to sort of the sincerity of Mooney's mother, who, by the way, I don't think ever lived to see her son released, which he eventually was in 1939 after spending 23 years in prison. So there's some differences between the earlier series. The colors get bolder. There is a greater attention to the sort of architectural details, especially in all of the brickwork in here, which gives us that really thrusting perspective towards the figure of Mooney in the middle. But unlike the Sacco and Vanzetti series, which made Sean famous and was received very, very well, these were not received as well by the critics, who maybe because it had been done already, some critics responded to it as being sort of repetitive. And you could see even here on purpose sort of the repeated figure of his mother. And he actually also made individual pictures like of the mother, of the communist demonstration. That 15 painting series has all of these components in it. This was probably a plan for a large scale mural painting, but it was never completed. However, between the Sacco and Vanzetti and the Mooney series, you could see the way that art had this huge role to play in social activism. Oh, one other detail, which is kind of wonderful. If you look right over that communist demonstration, that crowd, towards the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see a little watch, a jeweler's watch hanging from a post. That was a very specific reference to a detail in Mooney's case. So when Mooney was being charged, some of the evidence that was brought out in his favor was that there was a photograph taken of Mooney a mile away from the bomb site on the day of the bombing, and there's a giant watch, like a tower with a clock on it behind him, and it said the time 2:01, and the bomb went off 2:06, and he would not have had the time to get from one location to the other. So that was used as evidence of his innocence, but was ignored. And so when you see that little watch hanging there, it says 2:01, that's a reference back to the details of this case, which again come from photographs. Now, I'm putting in another artist into this category, which is Isamu Noguchi, just because he's also a very, very interesting artist. There's a local connection to him as well, and he really is one of the most interesting sculptors of the 20th century. He worked in a lot of different media. He worked with different kinds of metals and woods and stone and things like water. And he creates all different kinds of objects, from sculptures to furniture to lighting design, ceramics, gardens, set design, architecture. He was born in Los Angeles to an American mother and a Japanese father, and he actually lived in Japan till he was 13 and then moved to Indiana. And he said that he had a Japanese childhood, but an American boyhood, with a paper route and everything else. He originally goes to New York and starts studying pre-med, taking pre-med classes at Columbia University, but then downtown he started taking sculpture classes, and eventually he leaves school and decides to pursue a career as an artist. And as you can see from this photograph, which I think is from around 1925, when he was about 20 or 21 years old, he originally pursued a career as a sort of an academic sculpture, very sort of traditional in terms of his style. But then in 1926, he saw the work of the modern sculptor Constantine Brancusi, and that changed his mind about art. And he ends up going to Paris in 1927 to work in Brancusi's studio, and he turns instead towards a more modern and abstract style. He becomes very politically active in terms of his art in the 1930s, and then will make images dealing with racism in America, which is what we're going to be looking at here. He also makes images having to do with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he himself will spend 6 months in an internment camp during World War II. Now, in some ways, we really can relate this work by Noguchi to Ben-Shahn because in both cases, the artists are responding to social injustice. In fact, Noguchi called this work a social protest. And in both cases, they're working from photographic and sort of media evidence. In this case, Noguchi is responding to the lynchings that were taking place of Black Americans after the Civil War. In this case, it was a very specific event, though, which was the lynching of a man named George Hughes in Sherman, Texas, in May of 1930. The story is so common. I mean, Hughes was accused of raping a white woman. He was at a courthouse where they were trying to hold a trial, but a crowd gathered outside to protest the trial. The crowd ends up burning down the courthouse. They take Hughes captive. They end up hanging him over a bonfire and ultimately burn his corpse. And photographs were taken and they were published. And so Noguchi had seen the photograph of his hanged and burned body in a communist magazine called Labor Defender. And apparently these images were published as a way to force FDR into enacting legislation against it. And this, by the way, the events of in Sherman following the lynching of George Hughes led to the Sherman riots of 1930. It led to the destruction of a lot of the Black businesses in the town. So it was a horrific event. And this is what Noguchi creates with this figure, which has been called lynched figure, but it's also called death. And it's been paired with another figure called birth, which is a white stone figure laying on the ground, which Noguchi had said was based on seeing a woman in a hospital giving birth, but certainly having the very black metal of this hanged figure next to the white figure also brings up the racial implications of the story revolving the accusations against George Hughes. So this is a metal object with real rope hung from these steel gallows. He exhibited the work 3 times in New York in 1935, and the critics reacted harshly against it. One New York Times critic called it, as a work of art, it seems merely sensational and of extremely dubious value. Another critic said it was bizarre and macabre. And then a New York Sun critic had this very interesting line. He said, "The gruesome study of a lynching with a contorted figure dangling from an actual rope may be like the photograph from which it is made, but as a work of art, it is just a little Japanese mistake." And so, of course, you see the way that some of the harsh criticism against Noguchi's object, which was seen as too realistic and too grisly, gets turned against his Japanese American identity, because there was a lot of anti-Japanese rhetoric as well in the 1930s. And I think Noguchi is certainly playing on that. It is based on a photograph, and you can find the photograph online. I just felt uncomfortable actually putting it in the PowerPoint because it's quite grisly. And this is made even more, even though it seems very abstract, it's interesting how people reacted to it. First of all, the body was abstract because the body was badly burned and contorted in this pose. But it's also made very real by the presence of the real rope and the real gallows that this hangs in the gallery. So it makes Noguchi a very good pair to Shahn to think about the way that they are creating and making these images very sort of real and very present. Although photography had been around since the late 1830s and was very commonly in use in the early 20th century, it gets used in different ways at different moments in time. So we saw, for example, artists in the Impressionist era who a lot of them began to use photography not only as an art in its own right, but as a preparatory tool, which is what we see Shahn and Noguchi doing as well. And there were times in history where photography was really vying with painting and trying to figure out what its identity was. So we get some photographers who were trying to make works of sort of high art in terms of their images. However, we're going to look at the way that photography plays into the movement in the 1930s of social realism, which actually had a very large role to play. But before I do that, I'm going to go back in time just a little bit. Just back to Alfred Stieglitz, who we talked about when we talked about 291 Gallery and the rise of sort of the American avant-garde. But Stieglitz, so you remember Stieglitz's role in establishing an art gallery and being one of the first to really promote American modernism and European modernism as well. But Stieglitz himself was a photographer, right? And he took up photography while he was an engineering student in Berlin. And when he came to the United States from Europe around 1890, he started working for the Photochrome Engraving Company in New York, and he began to make photographs on his own. And eventually he began to pursue photography on his own full time. So in his early works, he was making a lot of street photography in New York, and he was taking photographs of everyday scenes as he took them when he was traveling through Europe. Eventually, though, we know that he establishes the Photo Secession Group and the Gallery 291 or 291 Gallery. And he actually also, in addition to mounting traveling exhibitions, he also created the influential journal Camera Work. So this was actually published in Camera Work in 1911, though the photograph itself is from 1907. And it shows the way that Stieglitz took photographs, which was that he took very sort of straight, unmanipulated photographs. So no special techniques, no sort of double exposure or processing. He was really being quite a literal photographer. And this was a image he took while he was going to Europe, sailing to Europe aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm II. And he said that he had this sort of watershed moment. So he was traveling first class, and he was looking over the first class deck onto steerage below, which were the cheaper classes, the cheaper tickets. So he sort of walked as far forward on his deck as he could until he could see the steerage group down below. And these were a group of people who were being returned by the United States government to Europe after being refused entry into America. So he looked down on these people, and he ended up writing about what he saw. He said, "The scene fascinated me. A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right, the white drawbridge with its railings made of circular chains, white suspenders crossing on the back of a man in steerage below, round shapes of iron machinery, a mast cutting into the sky, making a triangular shape. I stood spellbound. I saw shapes related to one another. A puncture of shapes, and underlying it a new vision that held me. Simple people, the feeling of a ship, ocean, sky, a sense of release that I was away from the mob called rich. Rembrandt came to my mind, and I wondered what he had felt as I did. I had only one plate holder with one unexposed plate. Could I catch what I saw and felt? I released the shutter. If I'd captured what I wanted, the photograph would go far beyond any of my previous prints. It would be a picture based on related shapes and deepest human feelings, a step in my own evolution, a spontaneous discovery." So this was a very interesting idea, because when he looked down at these sort of dejected, rejected immigrants returning to Europe, it was the abstract shapes that created this response in him, like he was looking down at a sort of modernist cubist collage. But this photograph really leads sort of the charge towards what's going to be the very documentary photograph that was important to social realism in the 1930s. But the need for this sort of documentary kind of photography as a way to create social awareness really comes to its greatest apex in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So this is a time when there are failed banks and failed crops, which were bringing unprecedented hardship across the country. So in 1935, there was the creation of a federal agency that we called the FSA, which was the Farm Security Administration. It was originally called the Resettlement Administration. But basically, the agency's role was to educate people about the toll that the Great Depression had taken on especially rural populations, on farmers, on migrant workers, on miners, on all these sort of rural communities. So the driving force behind the project at the FSA was an economist whose name was Roy Stryker. He'd studied at Columbia University, and he ends up hiring photographers and sending them throughout the country to some of these worst impacted areas, places that were suffering from environmental things like the Dust Bowl, and to have them take photographs, not only so that these photographs could show the hardship that was being suffered by these people, but also because it was supposed to show how the government was working to improve the lot of these communities during the Great Depression. So this really was very much related to FDR and the sort of policies and the programs of the New Deal. So there were a number of photographers involved in the FSA in its earliest years, starting from 1935, 1936. Ben Shahn, along with Dorothea Lange and Walter Evans, were some of the primary photographers involved in this project. Now, we've already seen Ben Shahn and talked about the fact that he was an accomplished photographer. And I'm not going to talk about any one of these in particular. I just wanted to show you a few of them just because we had already talked about Shahn. And he gets involved in 1935 in the FSA. He worked as an artist for them and also sort of part-time as an unofficial sort of member of Stryker's photographic team. He understood the empathy. We already saw his attitude towards social justice, but this is what gave him the empathy towards addressing the plight of these people. And so he said at one point, "You're not going to move anybody with this eroded soil, but the effect the eroded soil has on a kid who looks starved, this is going to move people." So he understood that as much as the Dust Bowl resulted in the devastation of the land, they needed to focus on the people themselves to create this sense of empathy. Some people are less praising of his photographic technique. A little bit, the thought is that Shahn used the camera as a mechanical device. I mean, very often these two provided basis for some of his paintings. He would, for example, take a photograph of a church, and then later that exact photograph would end up being the background of a painting. And so, we can question, some people question about, the sort of artistic, the framing or the focus of his images, or whether the shadows are too dark. But for him, that was less of the issue. He used the photographs as sort of a sketchbook, mechanical sort of sketchbook. He spent 2 to 3 months in 1935 in the South and the Midwest taking these photographs. So this is very representative of what photography was doing towards the movement of social realism. One of the most important photographers involved in the FSA photographs was Dorothea Lange, who actually is a native New Jerseyan. She's from Hoboken, and she studied at Columbia University and then moved to San Francisco, where she set up a photography studio. So that became her profession. But she also, as the Great Depression began, she started to take images of labor demonstrations and bread lines in San Francisco, of migrants who fled towards San Francisco, and those photographs caught the attention of Stryker at the FSA. And so by late 1935, she was invited to work on this project. Dorothea Lange herself is an interesting character. She had polio when she was a child, when she was 7. which gave her physical issues that she then, recurred throughout her life. But she had a injured foot, sort of a twisted foot. It was a cause of the polio, and so she walked with a limp. She ended up marrying an economist, and he too was very interested in the trauma and then I suppose the data that could be gotten from the sort of migrant people she ended up photographing. And so he would travel with her when she went to go take photographs. And that caused her a lot of problems as a working mother. Her children apparently, even as adults, resented them quite a bit, and her especially, for having left them for months at a time to go take these photographs, because they were essentially put into foster care since her husband came with them. But it's this photograph that is one of the most famous of all of the FSA photographs. And it was originally published, and I believe anonymously. A lot of her photographs were published anonymously. And it has been called the Madonna of the Depression. It became sort of this iconic image. You can see that, like Sean, she's incredibly interested in evoking this sense of empathy. And she talked about the fact that she was a documentary photographer, but then she said, a documentary photograph is not a factual photograph per se. It carries with it another thing, a quality in the subject that the artist responds to. So she did often apparently stage some of her images rather than purely just take them, because she was trying to express something that maybe she wouldn't be able to if she just photographed chance encounters and things that happened. She's sort of famous for saying that a camera is a tool for learning to see without a camera. So this particular image she wrote about, she said, I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and she seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. So what the photograph is of a migrant farmer. So these are, migrant groups of rural farm workers, and she was there to pick a pea crop in California, and apparently the pea crop had frozen and stranded some of the migrant farmers, and so this woman was at a camp in Nipomo Valley, and that's where Lang found them starving. It's a young mother, the woman in the photograph. Her name is Florence Thompson. She was 32 years old, and we see her with 3 children, a baby in her arms, and then she's flanked by 2 older children whose faces that we don't see. And so instead, the focus is on the anguished and worried expression of the mother. You can see that, like Sean, she's trying to evoke or play on the themes that are religious. So like Sean turned Sacco and Vanzetti into sort of Christian martyrs, or used the form of a triptych for one of his images. Here, this was meant to evoke the idea of the Madonna and Child, right? The sort of religious image of especially the mother holding a baby. The work did work to create the kind of empathy that she wanted to. Lang was interested in the fact that, photography could reveal social justice and inequality. And so within a few days after this picture was printed in a San Francisco newspaper, food was rushed by people to the Nipomo Valley. So it actually did help to at least temporarily change the plight of the people in the photograph. So it was a very, very powerful image. It's become iconic. But it's actually one that Dorothea Lange doesn't repeat. This theme of the sort of woman and child, the Madonna and childlike theme, is something that was emotionally persuasive, but not something that she returned to during her career. Another of these FSA photographers was Walker Evans. And in New York City, Walker Evans actually shares a studio with Ben Shahn, so we could see the relationship between some of them. He was actually born in Missouri. He dabbled in painting and then ultimately wanted to pursue writing as a career. So he travels, he spends a year in Paris, but instead he turns towards photography. Although the relationship between literature and photography is so evident in his work because there is a sense of description and narrative and storytelling in his work that is really, really remarkable. Um, he talks about his interest in photography. He said this: "When I first made photographs, they were too plain to be considered art, and I wasn't considered an artist. I didn't get any attention at all. The people who looked at my work thought, well, that's just a snapshot of the backyard. Privately, I knew otherwise, and through stubbornness, stayed with it." So he's sometimes described as the straightest of the straight photographers, but in his work we can see this sense of storytelling and symbolism. But he did sort of, he was interested in photographing exactly people in their world, right? These sort of roadside stands, advertisements, simple homes. And he was hired by the FSA. Um, and in the summer of 1936, he lived in Alabama and moved through West Virginia with actually also with a writer. And so they were working sort of together on a project of writing text and looking at images. He said that he wanted to make work against salon photography, against beauty photography, against art photography. So we can see how much his photographs relate to some of the sort of rebelliousness that we saw in painting against the Academy. We can see here against photography that was supposed to be like art, glamorizing and heroizing its subject. So instead we get these very sort of simple, direct images. This particular image is a portrait of a room in a West Virginia miner's home. And you can see the way that he framed the image so that we focus on the young boy, but then on the wall, and it's a crystal clear image. On the back wall, we can see that the wall is decorated with advertisements of sort of happy homemakers and happy children and dogs and this sort of smiling Santa Claus, and how much those images are at odds with the image of the boy we see in this very stark setting on the other side of the room. So again, there's a lot of narrative and storytelling in the work. So now we're going to look at regionalism, which in some ways is a related but flip side of what we saw with social realism. In fact, sometimes social realism and regionalism get sort of grouped under the larger umbrella term of the American scene. But in this case, these regionalist artists were interested in, like the social realists, they were turning their attention to sort of depictions of contemporary American life. So they're very much like the photographs we just saw, the photograph of Walker Evans, for example, who was just, very straightforward recording what he saw. Well, we can see regionalism as being the sort of painterly side of that. These were paintings of typically American subjects and the American landscape. However, they're seen as sort of opposite in some ways to the social realists. The regionalists were more nationalistic and conservative as compared to the more left-wing social realists. However, both of these groups of artists, the social realists and the regionalists, sort of rejected European abstract, those sort of avant-garde tendencies in art. Like the photographers we just looked at, the regionalist artists were also sort of catapulted by a federal project. So the sort of crucial event in the movement, it was also in 1935, which was the establishment of what was called the Federal Art Project, which was a subdivision of the Works Progress Administration. And this was a government-sponsored program of mural and other kinds of easel paintings. There was a painting project. Really, it was a way to keep artists working during the Great Depression, but it also was a way to use the sort of influence of art in kind of the way that the FSA used photographers. So we're going to look at three separate artists: Thomas Hart Benton, and then Grant Wood and Edward Hopper. We'll begin by looking at Thomas Hart Benton, who's probably the most famous of these artists, of these American scene painters, who's very much associated with the regionalist movement. He was actually born in Missouri, but he moved to New York and sort of really worked in a more modernist language in the 1910s and 1920s. He went to Paris. He studied sort of contemporary avant-garde art. But by the time he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, which you can see here in 1934, he had fully rejected modernism. And he said, "I wallowed in every cockneyed ism that came along, and it took me 10 years to get all that modernist dirt out of my system." So he ended up moving back to Missouri, to Kansas City, and really becomes associated with this regionalist movement. And he becomes sort of, he falls out of favor with the sort of more left-leaning artists and groups of artists like we saw in New York City gathered around Stieglitz. Now, one of the things that the Federal Art Project commissioned quite a lot of were mural paintings. The term mural literally means related to a wall. So these are large wall paintings that really don't reproduce very well, but because you need to be in the room to experience them. They really enliven and they become a part of a space, almost like an installation. And this is one of Benton's great mural series, but he does quite a lot of them. These were commissioned in 1930 by the New School in New York City, the New School of Social Research. It was in Greenwich Village. It was a center of progressive thought. And the director, Alvin Johnson, commissioned this series of paintings to adorn a third-floor boardroom. He worked on it. Benton worked on these between 1930 and 1931 when the school opened. And they actually stayed in the New School building for more than 50 years. Eventually, they were sold. When the school sold them, they determined they made rules. They had to stay together. They had to stay in the United States. They were sold to basically what was Equitable Life Company, and they were then donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2012, which is where they are now. They've been restored and they've been installed with their original layout in this wonderful room, so you can kind of be in the middle of it. Interestingly, Benton was not paid to make these murals. He was told by Alvin Johnson, that school director, that he wouldn't be paid. And Benton said to him, "I'll paint you a picture in tempera if you finance the eggs." So in other words, he was paid for with the medium of the paint. This is painted on tempera, egg tempera, which is a kind of paint where the pigment is mixed with egg yolk and some water. It's an alternative, and an old-fashioned alternative to something like oil paint. In any case, the reason he accepted the project, even though he wasn't getting paid, is that even though Benton was about 40 years old when he did this cycle, he still was struggling a little bit as an artist. So he looked at this project also as a way for him to improve his career. And so we have our paintings on 4 separate walls, and each wall represents a different region. So there's a wall dedicated to the South, the Midwest, the West, and then New York. And overall, even though there are references to the Great Depression, and this again was, they didn't know how bad the Great Depression was going to be in 1930 when he started making these images, the overall theme is about progress and technology and industrialization of America. He traveled to make this series, or he based it certainly on some of his images from his travels, where he had traveled across the country and he'd made sketches. And so what Benton said about this, he said, every detail of every picture is a thing I myself have seen and known. Every head is a real person drawn from life. So we'll zoom in and we'll look at some of the individual walls and one of the panels. And here you can get a sense of just how dynamic these images are. And you can see all different kinds of subjects and production, from the top right image here, which is an image showing scenes of cotton workers. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer. Here you could see a scene of the Deep South and cotton workers. You could see the images made up of these sort of contrasts. So we have this very high-placed figure of a black man standing over his white counterpart on the opposite side. In the background, we could see a steamship being loaded more with cotton. We see a chain gang in the foreground. We see scenes of all the sense of industrialization and mechanization and progress. We could see trees being cut down here to fell, well, not only to fell the trees, but to create room for crops and the growth of corn, which we see machinery doing. There are images below related to coal and mining and steel and city building. Right? So you could see city building on the lower left-hand corner, where again we see the towering black figure standing over his white co-workers. In the middle distance, we could see a scene of gangsters. So this is sort of a city scene. In all of the backgrounds, we see the growth of buildings and the rise of the landscape. We could see grain elevators on one wall, paired with skyscrapers being built on the other, and smokestacks. These are the two larger walls. The two smaller walls show the north wall entirely dedicated to New York City. Except for over the doorway, there is a panel that only shows hands reaching into the scene, some of them reaching for food and others reaching for money. So this is a scene related to the Great Depression. And then we have these scenes which are New York City life, and we see dance halls and burlesque clubs and circus performers, and we see scenes of subway riders. So this is all the movement and the dynamism of the city in this jazz age. By the way, when Benton said that it's all real people in the scene, we can see Benton's portrait himself here with his patron in the bottom corner. And then we can see in this scene, I think right next to him, I think that was Benton's wife. Down below, you can see the smallest panel on the smallest wall, which is simply called the Instruments of Power, which is the only scene in the room that has no people in it. But it's, again, all about this idea of mechanism and of industry. And I'll just show you this one panel of city building a little more closely so you can see something of his style. You'll notice that all of the panels have this these wooden moldings covered with aluminum leaf, so it looks almost, again, industrial and metallic. You see them not only around each individual panel like a frame, but you also see these interesting pieces of molding that jut into and break up the image on the inside. So they're very inventive in creating these breaks, so there's not all one space within the panel. And these very much echoed sort of the Art Deco style of the building in which this was constructed. So this was very much made for its site. You can also see the style of the figures, which are very dynamic. They're made of these curving forms. he's basing the figures really on sort of 16th century art, looking back on Michelangelo, for example, with these very sort of exaggerated, heavily muscled bodies. You could see these very sharp changes in scale and proportions, which is what makes the figures so heroic. So these laborers, even though this is very much about industrialization and mechanization or whatever, it's the figures that are sort of working the machinery. And so we see these bodies in the foreground on the left-hand side that are larger than the sort of booms in the landscape in the back on the right. Another painter very much associated with the regionalists was Grant Wood, who was a painter from Iowa. He traveled to Europe, though. He first studied there in 1923, but he made 4 separate trips. But he apparently was never very much tempted by European modernism. However, his work was influenced by what he saw. He went to Munich in 1928. And he saw 15th century German art as well as the works of the new objectivity painters. And this supposedly gave him a little bit of inspiration, interestingly, to come to his own American style. But I think he was very much interested, especially when he was looking at 15th century art, in the sort of simplicity and archaic style of it, which did influence his own painting. This work becomes his most famous image, and it instantly made Grant Wood famous. And it's known as American Gothic. You could see just this 2 people who are supposed to be a farmer and his daughter in front of this small house. And at the very center of the picture, we see this lancet window, that pointed window right between their 2 heads, which is a style that we see in Gothic architecture. And so we have American Gothic. In terms of its subject and its reaction, it's quite interesting because some people praised it as being very American and showing the strength and the dignity and the integrity as sort of the true spirit of America, while other people who saw it thought that it had a very unsympathetic view of life in Middle America. And it was also viewed as being very sort of nationalistic, which in 1930, with the rise of sort of nationalism in Germany, that wasn't always read in a positive light. Wood actually in 1935, so a few years after this, published an essay called Revolt Against the City. And in it, he said, your true regionalist is not a mere eulogist. He may even be a severe critic. So he opens up the door for the fact that this was meant to be satire. However, when he was asked about the subject, he said he instead painted them out of affection, not critique or ridicule. In terms of style, well, it is a ridiculously simplistic picture. And that was supposed to be part of its style. Maybe, this sort of simple composition with these straightforward figures and this sort of generic background was supposed to be reflective of the banality of the lives of the figures. It's a very dryly painted picture. It's got very sort of flattened forms, very sharp edges, almost sort of related to the photographs that we saw coming out of the FSA artists. The people in the picture were not really a farmer and a daughter. Instead, the people who he used as his models were actually his sister and a dentist from Iowa who were the models, and they were actually not related. But again, you could see this sort of miniaturist style, which is something he got from looking at 15th century German painting, but also from looking at photography. So this very much fits into this idea of what we saw in artists like Walker Evans, like that he was painting very much straightforward the lives of the people of rural America as he saw them. Another artist that we associate with the regionalists was Edward Hopper, although Hopper did not associate himself with Benton and artists like the Regionalists. He said that they were making caricatures of America and of their inhabitants. So he's much more of an urban artist rather than an artist associated with rural America. And he was actually a student of Robert Henry, who we saw from the Ashcan School, which really you could think of the Ashcan as sort of the predecessors of the social realists of the 1930s. Like some of our other artists, like Wood, he went to Europe several times. Between 1906 and 1910, he went to France. And so he was in France at the time of the rise of Fauvism and Cubism, but he wasn't that affected by what he saw. So instead, he, in many cases, paints architectural settings, many of the city, and the sort of isolated inhabitants that occupy them. Now, this is one of his most famous pictures, which is called Early Sunday Morning. That's not what he originally titled it. He originally titled it 7th Avenue Shops. And he said it wasn't necessarily Sunday. That word was tacked on later by someone else. It is literally like a translation of what he saw on 7th Avenue. And it's a remarkable picture. It has a lot in common with what we saw in the works of de Chirico. If you think way back to de Chirico, in this idea of these architectural settings that are uninhabited or nearly uninhabited. And Hopper had originally painted a figure in one of the windows, but then painted it out. Instead, what we're left with is a composition that is made up of grid-like horizontals and verticals with this stretch of sort of dreary, undifferentiated storefronts moving sort of across the picture. There's very little other sense of space. We have this little cube of blue showing us a view to the sky, and there's a little strip of ground in the foreground. But other than that, it almost looks like a stage set. And he may originally have been inspired by a play. There was a play called Street Scene that he had seen at the Playhouse Theater in New York. And he was interested in stage design, and we can see some of that here. You could see that there's no narrative. So we think of someone like Walker Evans, who showed the world that he saw, but there was this sense of story and meaning in it. And here we have a rejection of that kind of narrative. It is a literal view of what he sees, but any kind of meaning relies on our imagination. Right? Because there's a suggestion, maybe there's a very evocative use of light, for example, with these very long shadows that some of them, you could see one long shadow sort of moving into the scene, but there's no real sense of any kind of meaning. It just looks like this isolated, lonely sort of view of modern life. There's not a lot of detail either, and Hopper had early in his career worked as a commercial illustrator, which was heavily reliant on detail. And so you could see he rejects that in works like this. We can't read the signs on the windows, and you can see the brushwork and how loosely it's painted. Even though it looks sort of like photorealist in a way, when you look at the details, you could see that there's not details. It's all very broadly painted, the forms, the shutters, the blinds. You can all see how quickly it's painted and how much you could see that it's not a photograph, that it's a painting, because it's exaggerating the brushstroke. And this becomes Hopper's sort of canonical style, very much fitting with Depression era images and this sort of interest in the national kind of mindset, but very different than artists like Benton. One of Hopper's most famous images, probably his very most famous image, is the painting known as Nighthawks, which is very much related to Early Sunday Morning, although here we see a few inhabitants in this otherwise abandoned city. Hopper called the United States a chaos of ugliness. there seems to be, again, this sense of loneliness and isolation that's being expressed about the modern city. So even though it's the city, which is usually something that's very dynamic, we get a sense here that time is stopped and there's a sort of suspended state of movement. In terms of how he painted, though, it was very traditional and figurative and sort of very literal. And again, that was something that we saw with regionalism, which is why we put Hopper there, even though, once again, it is a city scene. It's not an exact building the way that we saw his image of 7th Avenue, but instead this seems to have been adapted for a number of different buildings that he saw near his home in Greenwich Village. What we're looking at is a night cafe. It's a cafe scene at night. So this is a subject that we're used to from way back from Impressionism, the idea of cafe scenes. And certainly this picture maybe has something in common with Van Gogh and the Night Cafe, which Hopper knew that work. He saw it quite a few times. And like the Night Cafe, this picture has been described as feeling sort of sinister because of its very dramatic lighting, because of the sort of boldness, sort of complementary colors, that red and that green sort of pop out at you, and then you get this harsh glow of the yellow light. But once again, there's no real sense of narrative. We're left with sort of applying our narrative onto the scene and what it tells us about modern man. He just described his painting very straightforward, and he didn't care for abstraction, which he thought was arbitrary and self-indulgent. He said, "My aim in painting is always, using nature as the medium, to try to project upon my canvas my most intimate reaction to the subject as it appears when I like it most." So here we are looking into this brightly lit interior through a big plate glass window. And again, very reductive. He's reduced everything to light and to these geometric, sort of very rectilinear, compressed sense of space. Very much a part of these American scene artists are the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And we can see their relationship with regionalism in a way, even though urban, and social realism. So after the Civil War, there was a period in the decades that followed the Civil War. There was a period known as the Great Migration, when 300,000 African Americans left the American South and moved towards the North and towards the Midwest. There were a number of reasons for this. Certainly, chief among them were the Jim Crow laws, which perpetrated discrimination and segregation, the rise of things like lynchings, and also some of the crises in the rural farming areas also led to people to be without work. Whereas at this very same moment, especially in the early years of the 20th century, American cities, especially you think cities like New York and Chicago, were booming. And after World War I, there was a need for workers, especially as immigration had slowed. And so companies needed workers. They actually were sort of courting people to travel up to these cities. And so you get this mass migration of many people, and 175,000 Black Americans settle in Harlem. This was spurred on in part by a March 1925 issue of Survey Graphic magazine, which called Harlem sort of this mecca for the Black American. And so this 3 square mile area had so many people there. This was the largest concentration of Black people in the world in an area. And it became not just an epicenter of Black American culture, but it became an epicenter of American culture. There was large concentrations of intellectuals, artists, writers, and so this was a period of tremendous artistic production, and we'll take a look at a few of the artists who emerge out of this movement. One of the most influential and important artists of the Harlem Renaissance was Aaron Douglas. So Douglas was born in Topeka, Kansas, and originally debates whether he should pursue a career in either art or law, but he ends up going to the University of Nebraska, where he graduates with a fine arts degree in 1922, and then he started working as an art teacher. Now, back in Harlem, there was a man named Charles Johnson who was actively courting young black intellectuals, poets, writers, artists, and encouraging them to come to Harlem, to New York City. And in fact, Johnson's secretary in 1924 wrote a letter to Douglas encouraging him to leave his teaching position and come to New York. But in 1925, he didn't leave his job right away. He read that issue of Survey Graphic, which called Harlem a Mecca. And he ended up saying that was the most single important factor in his decision. And so he left his teaching job. He said originally that he was going to go to Paris to study art, but that on his way he stopped in Harlem and he stayed. It is interesting, he was in Topeka, and Topeka had about 10% of the population was black, which was a thriving black community and much greater than the state average. But he moved to Harlem, where he could contribute to this new thriving community of 175,000 people, including all of these intellectuals and artists and writers. And so he ends up making some of the most important work that comes out of that, including illustrations he makes for a book called God's Trombones. Now, God's Trombones was Douglas's second collaboration with the writer James Weldon Johnson. So he had already worked with Johnson. Who was a writer and a civil rights activist, when he republished his 1912 autobiography of an ex-colored man in 1927, and Douglas did the book jacket for him. And now in this case, Johnson commissioned Douglas to illustrate God's Trombones. And Douglas ends up doing 7 paintings that are based on this book, which is a book of poems, which are in turn based on the preachings of a minister. So here you can see one of Douglas's illustrations from the cover, and you get a little bit of a sense of his style. But we'll look at one of the pictures inside. And just to make the note, this is then a collaboration between Douglas and Johnson. Like we saw, I mentioned that Walker Evans collaborated with a writer. And so we see that here as well. He's literally inspired by and illustrating these different poems. So this is sort of, he's literally illuminating what he saw in the written word. So this is one of the images on the inside of the book, one of the paintings he does. He did each of the paintings in 2 separate versions, one in gouache and then one in oil on masonite. So this is sort of one of the later versions, and it is a scene of Noah's Ark. So you could see that Douglas, unlike some of the other American scene artists we've been talking about, is much more in tune with modernism. So rather than rejecting some of the more, contemporary artistic movements in Europe, he's embracing them. He's also very much related to some of the American movements we saw, like Precisionism with Sheeler and Demuth. So we can see a relationship to synthetic cubism and also to the sort of monochromatic nature of analytic cubism, like we saw with earlier Picasso and Braque. Here we could see the figures are all incredibly flattened, and we can see these transparent sort of angular planes. So it's a monochromatic palette, but he changes the depth or the saturation of the color. But it is a very two-dimensional image. There's no sense of strong diagonals or foreshortening, so there's no real perspective, there's no modeling of the individual panels. Instead, everything is sort of canceling three-dimensional depth. And that's perhaps because it is also meant to be a religious image, and so this gives us a sense that this is some sort of artistic vision. In addition to being very much inspired, though, by modernism, he's also inspired by um, Egyptian art. And for him, Egypt represents Africa. And so there's a relationship between Egyptian art and the sort of Black American experience. So this is sort of a way of looking back at heritage and African ancestry to him. So we can see in the reference to Egyptian art, for example, on the figure that we would identify as Noah, who is up at the top of the ark directing what's going on. This is a very Egyptian styled figure. Egyptian figures usually would show what we call composite pose of the figure, where you would see a head in profile, but the body frontal. And so that is a very Egyptian sort of flattened characteristic of the kind that you would see in tomb paintings, for example. Other than that, we see the enormous Noah's Ark as the storm approaches. We could see workers loading the ship, another one on the ship. We can see a pair of birds approaching, and then some sort of large cats, panthers or tigers, walking into the ship. And then there is this foreground figure, and the only thing that gives us a sense of space at all are some of the variations of saturation, where things in the distance become less saturated, but also sense of scale. And so we see this strongly silhouetted flat figure in the foreground that may be a representation of the author himself, which of course by author we mean both the written author in Johnson, and we also mean the artist author in Douglas. And you can see that that's where he signs his name. And just to show you that Douglas didn't just work in sort of these smaller medium. I mean, those paintings were, average sized paintings, but they were intended really as book illustrations. So I wanted to show you that Douglas also worked in murals, as a lot of artists in the 1930s did. Again, this is like the great age of mural painting. So Douglas, in the 1930s, worked as an assistant professor of art education at Fisk University, which is in Nashville. And then in 1930, he was actually asked to create a series of murals for a brand new library being constructed on campus. And this would really be his legacy at Fisk, although he eventually would get a full-time appointment there in 1940, and he would help create the arts education program there and build the art department. He and his wife, though, kept their Harlem apartment, and they split their time between them so that he remained very active in the Harlem community as well. These pictures, they've been recently restored. Very, very hard to find good photographs of them, but I just thought they were interesting because they are spread out over 3 separate rooms, like a continuous narrative. In other words, we're watching a story in different moments. And it was supposed to illustrate sort of the progress of Black people in America and around the world over time across continents. So it extends through 3 separate rooms. This is the first room, which is the North Reading Room. And here you could see the upper section of the walls, which are painted with sort of these jungle scenes, which are supposed to represent Africa. Here you could see the scenes of African slaves. On the very right-hand side, we see a slave ship moored off the coast, and we see figures in chains moving down towards the ship. You can see Douglas's style again, these flat, unmodulated colors, those sort of transparent planes or lines of movement. Here a little bit more subdued, but you can see it in the backgrounds, for example. And that same silhouetted style that very much was referential to Egyptian wall paintings, once again. First of all, because these are wall paintings, and Egypt, they would have low relief carvings or paintings on tomb walls. And again, we see that Egyptian style of a figure with the frontal body, with the profile face and the profile legs. Usually that gives a tremendous sense of stillness to the figures, and you could see that here, though some are more dynamic. It was impossible to find good photographs of the next room, which is the South Reading Room, where we start to see education as a path out of bondage. And so this is sort of post-slavery. It doesn't say where we are still in the world, but we can see some references to how things are changing. You see a figure in a graduation gown and cap holding a diploma. There's another figure here, again in that Egyptian pose with his hand on a globe. Another figure here peering through a microscope. And then when we moved into the room called the Rotunda, which was the old card catalog room, back when there were card catalogs and you had to look up the book you wanted in these series of drawers. Here you could see the card catalogs down below. But above the card catalogs in these arched spaces, we then saw different paintings dedicated to different fields of study. So here you can see one that is dedicated to science and astronomy. Here you could see just a section of one. This is a scene dedicated to philosophy. Here, a scene dedicated to drama. So this is very much in keeping with the library decoration. Oh my gosh, think back to Klimt and his library decorations for Vienna. And so here you see this very sort of American version of that scene. Again, drawing from all these different cultural inspirations. Here you could still see these references to Cubism, though I think how interesting it is that those angular lines have now turned into all of these circular forms, almost evoking the shape of a globe. Now, Jacob Lawrence was one of the younger artists that we're looking at, who really during the Harlem Renaissance is still a very young man. He's actually born in New Jersey. So he was born in Atlantic City, though he spent his childhood in Pennsylvania and then eventually moved to Harlem, I think by the time he was 10. So he actually was sort of he saw this great migration that we've been talking about, this sort of move of many Black Americans from the rural South up towards the Northeast and the North and the Midwest, was something that was sort of his world in a way, even though he was born in New Jersey. It was part of his experience. And he said, I was part of the migration, as was my family, my mother, my sister, and my brother. I grew up hearing tales about people coming up, another family arriving. I didn't realize what was happening until about the middle of the 1930s. And that's when the migration series began to take form in my mind. So these were things that he heard about from talking to his family, and he actually does quite a bit of research about it as well. But he ends up doing this series of 60 paintings. And this is, here you could see some of them installed on a wall from around 1941. And then the year after they were finished, he worked on them from 1940 to 41, it went on a National Museum tour that was organized by the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. So it becomes reproduced in Fortune magazine. 26 of the panels were reproduced. So this brought him quite a bit of fame and attention in short order. So it's often thought of as being sort of like a mural because there's 60 different panels, but they're small and they're portable and they're intimate. And so sometimes instead we look at this as like a musical score, like a big ballad, and we're looking at individual stanzas in that song. Now, as I said, there are 60 of them, so I can show you very quickly a few, and we'll look at panel 3 in a little bit more detail. But you can see how it's meant to chronicle the pathway of this movement. And it begins with panel 1, which is the train station. And here you could see people flocking towards those cities that really received the bulk of the migrants, which were New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. And Lawrence wrote about this. He said, well, just take the word migration. It means movement from one place to another. So I have a symbol of movement, the train, people carrying sacks and bags and suitcases, the railroad stations. Probably there were more bus stations than railroad stations at that time. So right away you get the feeling. I get the feeling of movement, which has always been a very beautiful thing to me in content and in formalistic terms. There's a forward, I think, in terms of something moving forward, not something retrogressing. He said there that, oh, there were probably more bus stations and train stations. These were things that he was actually trying to learn himself about the experience. So here you could see in panel 1, people flocking to train stations. We see migrants moving on foot in panel 3, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. And then eventually in the series, we see people making their way to the north and establishing a life there. So panel 58, towards the end of the series, show 3 girls of varying heights writing on a blackboard, writing math, wearing these very bright colors, and we get the sense that they're in a modern classroom. And one of the things that really compelled people also to move north were the opportunities for education, because in the South, the local and state governments gave very small amounts of money for Black public schools, and the opportunities were better in the northern cities. You can see, even though the panels are very separate, they are united in style, though. He keeps the same silhouetted forms of figures that we saw Douglas playing with as a way of representing masses of people by not individualizing them, presenting them as silhouettes. It does also, in some of the figures, have this sort of Egyptian sensibility to it, but you can see that the individual panels are connected by this very bright abstracting sort of palette, this bright, bold, flat, almost cubist again inspired, almost collage inspired. It looks a lot like synthetic cubism, patches of shapes. And he talked about the importance of color. Lawrence said, in order to add something to their lives, Black families decorated their tenements and their homes in all these colors. I've been asked, is anyone in my family artistically inclined? I've always felt ashamed of my response, and I always said no, not realizing that my artistic sensibility came from this ambiance. It's only in retrospect that I realized I was surrounded by art. You'd walk 7th Avenue and look in the windows, and you'd see all these colors in the depths of the Depression, all these colors. And here I'm just showing you in more detail panel number 3, where we see the migrants moving on foot, weighted down with their possessions, these big bags and boxes, forming this dense clump of figures amidst this very shallow landscape. And again, there's all this denial of three-dimensionality. Space is somewhat compressed. We don't see a lot of modeling or shading in the figures, just these flat patches of colors, but still painted in a very painterly way. So we can see it's not collage. We can still see the movement of the brush. And we see these figures clumped together in a landscape, and the only other thing in the scene are the birds, these silhouetted birds, which mirrors their forms moving through the sky. And they're meant to be both a parallel and a counterpart. On the one hand, we see what feels like the freedom of the birds, the ease of their movement, which is very different from the struggle that we see of the figures carrying their possessions in the foreground. But again, also there was this hope and desire for change despite the difficult journey. So they represent the freedom of these people and the hope for the future. On the other hand, they also offer us this counterpart. The fact that he chose to show blackbirds, that was a racial trope and a racial slur where African Americans were referred to as crows or shown as blackbirds, and the segregation laws which passed in 1877 were called Jim Crow laws. So this also shows the laws and the way of life that forced these people to abandon their homes in search for something new. So that is as far as I'm going to get today. I know that was a lot, but it's such good stuff. And I will see you all next week.